Tonight we find ourselves in the very distant past. Imagine a cold winter night around 20,000 years ago. A small group huddles inside a shelter built from mammoth bones and hides. Outside is endless windswept grassland, where herds of mammoths and woolly rhinos roam and predators wait in the dark. Inside, fire flickers on decorated walls, children are wrapped in fur stitched with bone needles, and stories pass across the flames. Now let us begin with this question. How could someone with only stone tools and bone needles stand against winters far harsher than the coldest places on Earth today? Think about that. We cover ourselves in engineered fibres, insulated coats, and synthetic linings, yet we still treat the deep cold as something that needs machines, cars with heaters, houses with wires, boots filled with foam, and yet, people of the Ice Age met conditions colder, longer, and more relentless than our winters. They had no electricity, no factory-made gear, no rescue lines. Somehow, they managed not only to survive, but to move across whole continents draped in snow and wind. The first line of defense was not fire, not food, but what they built to wear on their bodies. It may surprise you, but their clothing worked as efficiently as some of the best textiles we rely on now. At first glance, it seems impossible. Cloth isn't preserved by time the way stone tools are, so we don't pick up 1,000-year-old coats from the earth. Instead, we find the hints, bone needles with small drilled eyes, smoothed and shaped for thread to pass cleanly through. These are not clumsy piercers, they're precise sewing instruments, the kind that let you cut hide into layers, overlap edges and stitch them tight. They suggest skill, planning and style adapted to each climate. A cloak draped at the shoulders might take you part of the way, but stitching a sleeve that seals out the draft or sewing leggings that hold heat against the skin takes something more, tailored thinking. Now let's pause with that bone needle. Imagine threading it with sinew, each pass through hide fine enough to stop air rushing through a seam. Without it, clothing slips and gaps. With it, clothing wraps and moulds around the body like a second skin. This was their insulation, their lifeline against a season that never really ended. Sometimes we only understand the true detail because graves were left for us to find layer by layer. Burials reveal hints, not just single hides laid for ceremony, but hundreds of animal skins carefully cut, dressed and sewn together. Picture a body wrapped in furs from head to toe, not random scraps but cloaks of fox, reindeer, wolf, all chosen for different properties. Some hides were prized for warmth, others for toughness, others perhaps even for markings that meant something deeper, symbolic or protective. We read these clues like detectives unwrapping an ancient coat. What we find is not a crude pelt thrown over a shoulder, but an idea closer to a wardrobe. One of the strongest allies in this tailoring was reindeer. Their hair is not solid but hollow, tiny tubes packed with air. That means each strand becomes a miniature thermos, trapping heat but staying light. Sewn together in layers, reindeer hides created garments warmer than heavy skins from many other animals. A coat stitched from hides like these can keep the body insulated the way modern synthetic fill does. We might think feathers or down are the symbol of efficient warmth, but hollow-haired fur was their engineered equivalent. In wet snow or freezing rain, the outer coats could be rubbed with fat or treated so the seams didn't leak. Water ran like beads, while the trapped air kept heat locked close. The more you look at it, the less primitive it feels. High-tech jackets today owe their success to the same principle: light layers sealed tight against air and water. When archaeologists recreate Ice Age garments based on the evidence of needlework, burial finds and fur types, they design outfits that can face Arctic winds head-on. In tests, these reconstructions outperform some of our store-bought coats. The tailoring of Ice Age hunters was not a poor imitation of our gear, It was survival technology tuned, tested, and perfected over generations. And think about what that means for daily life. You could not stand guard on a mammoth steppe in winter without full protective gear. If clothing failed, you froze. So layers were planned. Children wore scaled-down versions. Hunters wrapped themselves in long coats edged with fur cuffs, heavy boots padded with moss inside, and mittens that could be set aside for work. If seams split, survival depended on someone having needle and cord ready to fix them. Clothing wasn't fashion in the Ice Age, though it may have carried meaning. It was the first wall against extinction. It's worth pausing here on seams. A seam may look ordinary, but Ice Age craft treated it like plumbing. Stop the leaks, and the system works. They lapped hides, overlapped edges, sealed them with sinew thread drawn tight. Sometimes fat or resin may have been pressed into the seams, waterproofing them further. If you have ever worn modern waterproof gear, you know taped seams are the make or break feature. They thought the same. A single hole leads to a draft. A draft robs core heat. Seal the holes, and the protection holds steady. It's a level of detail that speaks of trial, error, and memory refined across long winters. Now compare the two worlds for a moment. Our technology often works by shortcut. Mass-produced fabrics that do the work of 100 skins. Their technology was slower, but no less effective. They turned wild creatures into partners in survival, each hide harvested, softened, and fitted into a garment that bore as much planning as a toolkit. Where we choose between brands of synthetic jackets, they chose between species, textures, and designs. The outcome was the same: warmth, mobility, endurance. We sometimes imagine Ice Age people as half-naked behind fires, rawhide cloaks flapping in the wind. But evidence paints a different scene. Clothing was structured, layered, and sewn with care. In fact, if you put a modern hiker in jeans and a sweatshirt onto the mammoth steppe, they wouldn't last the night. If you put an Ice Age human in their traditional clothing there, they could walk into the dawn. That gap changes how we see them, because clothing was not a stopgap, it was innovation. At its height, Ice Age tailoring met and sometimes exceeded what specialist gear achieves today. With bone needles, sinew thread, and the hollow fur of reindeer and fox, they designed microclimates for their own skin. What looks simple on the surface is, on closer study, a system of survival. And that system carried them through an age when cold defined the horizon. Clothing was the first skin. Now shift with me to the second. The walls they built to hold the storm outside. Outside, the air howled like a living thing. Snow whipped past in sheets, carrying dust and ice that burned the skin if you let it meet your face. And yet inside, tucked behind walls built from bones and hides, the air was still. Firelight warmed a ring of figures, the crackle of wood and fat masking the wind. A place like that wasn't luck, it was design. Shelter may seem simple to us now. Lay stone, cut wood, raise walls. But in the Ice Age, the building blocks we know best were scarce. Trees were scattered or stunted across much of the tundra, unable to grow tall in the frozen ground. Straight trunks, which you and I might think of first when picturing a roof, were some of the rarest things on the steppe. And yet, people built rooms where whole families stayed warm through nights colder than any we imagine. How did they do it? By using what their world had in abundance. The bones of mammoths were not only reminders of giant life outside, they were the beams and pillars of homes. Imagine a skull the size of a barrel, placed on its side to form part of a wall. Tusks curved like great arches were leaned together, stacked, tied, and covered. Ribs, broad, sweeping, heavy, were driven into the earth as supports. Hides stretched over them were stitched tight so the wind could not tear them back. The structure might look crude to us at first, a jumble of ivory and skin. Step closer though, and you see pattern, Ringed circles of bone laid to break the wind. Entrances cut low so heat pooled in the centre. Roofs angled just right. Stitched seams sealed, able to shed rain and snow. Not every structure was a great mammoth-bone hut. In some regions, caves became the safest option, their stone mouths opening into chambers already hidden from the gale. A cave had its own risks: damp, confined space, darkness that swallowed a flame. But it also offered natural protection, turning bare rock into a shell against storms. People learned to tame the hazards. Hearths dug into the ground kept smoke from choking them. Fires lit in deeper recesses dried the walls. Niches were used for storage, for tools, for carved objects. A cave was not just a crack in the rock. It became a lasting dwelling, layer by layer reshaped by those who left marks on its skin. And still, there were places with neither bone to gather nor cavern to crawl into. Here, people turned to the earth itself. Semi-subterranean homes were scooped into the soil, pits dug down below the reach of the wind. Walls were built of turf and stone, lined with whatever could offer insulation. Roofs stretched over the top, angled low, held by lighter materials found nearby. By living partway underground, the people borrowed the warmth of the soil, which held steady even when the air froze solid. Step into a pit house like this, and you would notice how the cold light dims, how the air calms, how outside noise falls quiet. Think again about the problem they faced. No forests, no saws, no metal nails. They built instead with what the land offered: tusks, skulls, hides, sod, stone. In those hands, materials we might discard became tools of design. Each house was not just a shield against weather, but also a symbol of memory, passed on from one group to the next in shape and expression. To us, a pile of bones might look wasteful or strange. To them, bones were stronger than logs. Tusks curved with natural grace, skulls dense enough to face a storm. This was engineering, though we may not call it that. Weight was distributed by careful placement. The arcs of tusks bore strain like arches. Layers of hides created shells as tough as canvas stretched across poles today. Fire built inside heated stones, and those stones, once warmed, radiated for hours. Heat retention and insulation were not abstract theories. They were daily realities. Think of each shelter as a machine built to trap life against overwhelming odds. In the wider picture, these homes were also anchors. They marked places where herds passed, where rivers cut open paths, where flint could be found. A hut made of bone was not meant for a season only. Some were rebuilt across years, showing patterns of return. A cave painted with images was not only a roof for the night, it became a place of memory. Pit houses in frozen soils were dug where caribou might cross, or where waters thawed in spring. Building a shelter meant staking a claim in a world that could expel you within an hour if you chose poorly. Let's imagine a mammoth-bone hut from the inside. The floor is covered in hides layered for softness. Stones line a fire pit in the middle. Smoke drifts but escapes through cracks carefully left at the top. Around the fire are tools, beads, weapons ready for a hunt. The walls gleam white where ivory shows through, but hides block out the draft. Each corner holds pieces from many hunts, many hands. It is not a tent, not a hut, but something closer to a fortress against the wilderness. Of course, storms came. Snow burrowed into gaps, tore at seams. Repairs mattered. A rib could splinter, tusks could slip, hides could sag under wet weight. People had to watch, patching holes, bracing against collapse. Shelter was never finished. It was alive, an object in constant need of care. Perhaps this maintenance itself became part of their rhythm. Wake, check the seams, stoke the fire, scrape cracks clean of snow. Survival was not only hunting and clothing, It was upkeep of the walls that made all else possible. Now compare this with structures we know in the modern world. We measure homes in walls of brick, insulation of fiberglass, roofs of slate. Yet the same logic applies. Heat moves in familiar ways, and the cold presses by the same laws. They understood these principles without physics texts, only through slow burn trial and error. If warmth leaked through seams, or if the draft cut too strong, the result was immediate. Failure stood one night away. Gradual refinement led to designs that worked, designs that could last. In the end, call them huts or shelters or houses, each was more than a pile of pieces. They were engineered refuges, positioned, shaped, sealed. They learned to bend the bones of giants to weather storms harsher than modern Antarctica. Survival depended on it. The walls kept the wind, the roof shed the snow, but flame kept the hours. Every good shelter had a gap above and a ring below, smoke speaking out, heat staying in. Come close to that circle before we step back into the open world. You crouch at a low hearth. Fat pops as it drips onto glowing coals. A ring of stones holds the flame in its circle. Smoke threads upward, not by accident, but toward a seam left open in the shelter's top. It escapes in thin lines, not flooding the air. For a moment you hear wind outside, only then realize how controlled this pocket of night has become. Fire here is not chance, it is managed. The uses of fire are easy to list: warmth, light, protection from animals. But if we stay with them for a moment, each grows more complex. Think of the warmth first. Outside, it can be far below freezing, cold air rushing in waves. Near the flame, in a ring just a few paces wide, the temperature rises enough that toes thaw, hands soften, and breath no longer forms clouds. 15, maybe 20 degrees warmer in the circle of glow. The difference is not comfort, it is survival. With light, the effect doubles. Darkness in these latitudes arrives fast and stays for half the year in long stretches. A steady flame turns the night from blind fear into hours where tools can be finished or food prepared. Predators hesitate at the sight and smell, and cooked meat offers more calories than what is eaten raw. And yet these are only the first layers of what fire provided. Evidence still rests in the ground of how important it was. In Central Europe, scattered hearth clusters show how groups arrange themselves. Each ring of stones marked a centre of work, and multiple rings close together hint at families within a larger camp. Farther east, in bone houses built from mammoth remains, fire pits are found in the middle, radiating heat into rooms of hide and tusk. These traces are not single sparks left behind. They are patterns showing how central the flame became to daily life. Some of the cleverest adaptations came from asking fire to do more than burn. Take water, for instance. Leather or bark containers cannot sit directly in a fire, yet people wanted boiled water, whether to cook or to clean. The answer was stone boiling. Rocks heated in the flames were dropped into a bag or trough. They hissed and cracked, but they transferred heat. Soon the water itself bubbled and steam rose off the container without it ever touching the coals. Another example shines in fat lamps. Imagine a shallow dish of stone or bone filled with tallow, a wick set inside. When lit, it gave steady flame for hours, enough to move, carve, or paint when winter sun had long vanished. It smoked more than wood, but it lasted longer, allowing work to stretch into deeper night. And that is where the real contrast lies. With fire, time itself changed. Before, night meant stillness. Once darkness fell, you either slept or risked the predators. But with a lamp, with coals banked and hot stones at your side, nights could lengthen. Awake hours doubled, maybe tripled. Food stayed safer through cooking. Sparks hardened spear points. Smoke kept wolves shy. Without fire, The world was chaos every sunset. Cold seeping fast, pitch black, predators pressing close. With fire, the world ticked like a clock, stretched across a schedule you could trust. The knowledge that came with fire was also physical. A shaft placed in embers straightened when scraped, hardened when heated and cooled. Different stones reacted with different colours and textures if warmed before being struck. Flint, for example, can become easier to flake after slow heating. Striking tools from such prepared stone meant edges sharper, shapes easier to repeat. Birch bark left in embers under controlled airflow oozed a sticky black tar. That tar became adhesive for hafting blades into handles. Simple flames were, in truth, laboratories running at 300 to 400 degrees. Speculation can take us further, though we step carefully. Fire may have shifted human sleep. With light and safety by the coals, nighttime rest might have broken into parts, with waking intervals filled by talk, music, or watch duty. Some even suspect smoke had side benefits, keeping biting insects at bay in warmer seasons, or drying and preserving meat hung above the flames. If a haunch of reindeer lasted longer between hunts because smoke coated it, that one detail could shape survival for the whole group. Now picture the social side. A hearth was not only a tool, it was the axis of gathering. Children sat close, learning motions of spear throwers by watching elders repeat them in firelight. Hunters mapped the land aloud, pointing with half-burnt sticks to show where rivers met or where herds might pass. Music found space here too. Hollow bones with holes could sound, voices lined up against crackling wood. Stories stretched longer because the night no longer swallowed them in silence. In every sense, the firing built memory. Place a group around a hearth night after night, and layered knowledge starts to form. Lessons fix in rhythm of flame. Jokes, songs, tales attach themselves to the smell of smoke, to the glow in faces. And when one hearth cools and is left behind, another rises elsewhere. Living knowledge moves hearth to hearth, the flame serving as a bridge. Think of fire then as more than a tool. It became a machine for hours, keeping time, giving schedule. It served as a workshop, its heat shaping stone, wood and glue. And it worked as a memory engine, where one generation's stories fired the minds of the next. In that way, fire turned the Ice Age from a cycle of freezing nights into a sustained human rhythm. And yet all this flame, all this focus, had another consequence. As the fire stretched hours out, it demanded they be filled. More food could be cooked, more hides cut, more tools sharpened, more songs tried. In a sense, the hearth pressed people to live bigger lives within the same cold days. Control of fire meant control of time itself. So when you crouch again by that imagined hearth, fat popping and smoke rising through a seam, you see not only light against darkness, you see a clock ticking, a craft bench glowing, a stage for maps and myths. The fire was no single thing. It was infrastructure for the Ice Age mind. Fire wasn't just heat. It was a schedule, a workshop, and a memory engine. And from the flame that measured hours, we move to the food that filled them, the steppe's kitchen. Steam rises from a hide bag as stones heated to glowing red hiss and sink into the water. The air fills with damp warmth, a small fog inside the shelter. Someone cracks open the hollow of a reindeer bone with a sharp flake, and the rich marrow slides out, eaten quickly before it cools. Simple gestures, yet they carry weight. They tell us how food was managed when the world outside gave little and demanded much. So what did dinner actually look like on the mammoth steppe? To answer that, we need to think not in single dishes but in patterns. What was hunted, what was gathered, what was stored, and how it all kept families alive when ice pressed close. If we line up what the Ice Age offered, we see a varied menu. Big game formed the backbone, mammoths first in size but also bison, reindeer, and sometimes horse. These herds moved across the open plains, their bodies dense packages of fat and protein. Smaller animals played a role too: hares, birds caught in nets, ground-dwelling mammals that could be trapped. Fish swam in rivers that stayed ice-free just below the surface, and in shallow lakes they were speared or netted in summer months. Birds' eggs were quick gains when nesting seasons came. Even insects, though less noted, were an option when fuel for fire was short and herds had wandered too far. Plants were not absent, even if the ground looked bare. Roots tucked under soil, edible tubers, berries clinging in sheltered spots, seeds carried by winds and rivers all formed parts of the diet. A site along the shore of an old lake, Oharlo II in present-day Israel, froze a rare moment of this in time. Wild grains ground on stones, showing that people processed plants thousands of years before farming in the strict sense began. That find, laid down roughly 23,000 years ago, widens the frame. Food was not just chase and kill, it was sift, grind, and gather too. Now, the basic menu holds interest, but method brings it to life. Big animals were carved into usable parts and roasted over coals. Cuts placed on flat stones near the fire cooked slow, keeping juices sealed. That shows direct roasting as one core method. Yet roasting was only one circle of the flame. Stone boiling extended the range. You heat rocks until they glow, then drop them into water held in hide containers. The shock steams the liquid, raises heat, cooks grains or meat submerged. No durable pottery was at hand yet, but thoughtful use of skins, wood or stomachs let them improvise boiling vessels. Drying and smoking took that energy further still. Strips of meat could be hung above embers for days. Smoke both flavoured and preserved, while slow dehydration meant the meat held longer without rotting. Drying fish was common where rivers ran. A smoked store of salmon or trout could carry people through the snow season. One of the more curious setups was the pit-cooking earth oven. Stones were heated in a fire until glowing. Then food, wrapped in leaves or skins, was set in the ground, layered with the heated rocks, and buried over with soil. Hours later, air released with the smell of cooked fat and softened meat. This technique reveals an understanding of indirect heat. Like ovens we use now, it also shows patience. Food was left hidden and retrieved when hunger pressed. The process itself marks a step between striking sparks and building kitchens as systems. We might expect Ice Age life to be a constant chase after one prize animal, yet evidence suggests the opposite. People widen their portfolio. When mammoth herds moved out of range, they fell back on smaller game. When the climate snapped back into colder spells, berries or gathered seeds filled gaps. It wasn't feast versus famine, it was a pattern designed to avoid collapse. That mixed diet meant groups could bend without breaking. If they had chosen only to eat mammoth, the first missed hunt would bring disaster. Instead, skill was spread: trap a hare, spear a fish, dig tubers, harvest roots. It was a net of strategies, not a single bet. Food did not stand alone from tools. Bones and sinew, when stripped and cleaned, found use beyond the meal. Sinew became thread strong enough to bind hides or lash points. Intestines could serve as casings for meat, or even as water-holding tubes. Stomachs, cleaned out, worked as bags. Hunting, then preparing food, was also building an inventory of materials. A reindeer was not only a source of calories, but an entire toolkit. Meat for eating, marrow for fat, sinew for thread, antler for tool edges, hide for clothes, bone for needles and flutes. The loop was tight, no part wasted. When scraping hides to prepare for clothing, the scrapers themselves were often carved from other bones. In this way, every meal slid into the sphere of fabrication. A dinner yielded both food to eat and parts to store for next tasks. Still, there are parts left in shadow where we can only suggest. Consider fermentation. Cool pits dug into frozen soil or smoke shelters might have created conditions close to a primitive cellar. Did groups leave buried foods to collect faintly fermented flavours that lasted longer? Possibly. When preservation mattered, any stretch was welcome. Think too on marrow-rich soups. A broth made from shattered bones releases nutrients. For children or elders who could not chew dense meat, a hot soup fed strength back in small sips. In the harshest spells, such innovations could mean the difference between endurance and collapse. These ideas cannot be pinned with certainty, but sit in that intriguing space between evidence and inference. Feasting and fasting were patterns defined not only by herds but by sharing. A large animal killed by one group could never be eaten fully by a few hands before spoilage. To carve it up and distribute it created more than goodwill. It made a kind of insurance. If your group gave away chunks in your good season, the memory of that act meant you would be fed when your hunt failed. Modern economists might call it risk pooling. In human terms, it was social binding. To share food was to invest in the chance of return. The hearth, then, was not only a space to eat but a stage for that exchange. Songs may have risen after meals, stories built around hunts not only to remember, but to justify distribution. So let's picture this system in a single image. At the centre, the fire. Around it, strips of meat drying on racks, a hide bag hissing as stones boil a stew, bones waiting to be cracked for marrow. Beside them, tools being sharpened, sinew twined for thread, hides cleaned for clothing. Beyond the firelight, storage pits, maybe insulated with moss or snow where dried food waited. And surrounding it all, the conversations and rhythms of sharing, hands passing pieces, children given soft bits, elders drawing warmth from soup. This is dinner on the steppe. Not a plate, but a system. When we call it a system, we mean that survival sat not in one act but in their weaving. Hunt, gather, cook, preserve, share, recycle. Each step linked to the next. The logic resonates even today. Think of how a fridge works as a store, or how a pantry keeps things layered for future days. It builds security by pushing food forward into tomorrow. In the Ice Age, meat racks, pits, and smoked hides were their freezers and pantries. The concept holds across millennia. One more note on taste. It is tempting to think only in survival terms, yet the act of wrapping meat in hides for pit cooking implies more than blunt necessity. It signals care about tenderness, flavour, the slow shift from raw to cooked texture. Straight roasting was easier. To take the time to bury stones and wait builds a sense of cuisine. Even in harsh climates, the tongue asked for more than fuel. Herbs, smoke seasoning, perhaps. We can't say with full confidence, but we can imagine leaves and roots added into stews, flavour sought as well as calories. That human trait, seeking taste, is as enduring as sewing clothes or painting walls. Moving further out, whole landscapes were shaped by what could be eaten. Camps often appeared where rivers joined or where migration paths cut open fields. Dinner was not wherever you found it, but a predictable draw to places where foods could be counted on. Some groups returned season after season, knowing roots would emerge in thaw, fish would rise in summer, berries would blush by autumn. Their mobility circled these sites like a great kitchen spread across the land. Each movement was timed by food's availability. The mammoth steppe was less random roaming and more like circuits of grocery aisles set by nature. Food as skill, food as craft, food as alliance. Each piece tells us Ice Age dinner was less a recipe than a plan. That plan held resilience at its heart. Because when the climate lurched or storms dragged on, only planning helped you breathe into the next day. And here sits the quiet genius. People didn't just eat what wandered past, they engineered methods, They stored away shares. They negotiated surplus. They learned through slow burn repetition. They carved stability into uncertainty, one dinner at a time. You might wonder what it felt like. Did they hunger often? Did meals feel sparse? Likely so. But remember the scale of sharing. A child might gnaw marrow while an elder was given broth. The hunters ate strips charred on coals. The singers and toolmakers ate boiled roots softened for teeth. Variety was spread across hands, not piled on a single plate. And perhaps that's one of the deeper lessons. Food was distributed as lives required. Calories were tailored, not hoarded. As we leave this image, keep the phrase close. Dinner on the steppe was less a dish than a system, of skill, of careful storage, of deliberate sharing. It was how they evened out the gamble of weather and herd, and perhaps this system mattered as much to their survival as spears or clothing. And just beyond the firelight, a pair of watchful eyes lingered. Scraps, bones, and the warm rhythm of camps drew other neighbours close, first as shadows, then as regulars. From the steppe's kitchen to the first companions, wolves edging toward our circles and slowly into dogs. A ring of light, a ring of darkness. Beyond it, two eyes hover, steady, reflecting the flame yet not hurried away by it. They do not lunge forward. They do not flee back into the night. They stay, measured and deliberate, right at the edge where glow turns to shadow. For a group gathered around a long-burning fire, this must have been unsettling at first. Predators came and went with swiftness, but these eyes lingered. A wolf not hunting, not retreating, simply watching. The question begins here. When did wolves stop being faceless threats piercing the dark and start becoming partners stepping into its light? What shifted in both of us so that, across a slow span of years, fear became a form of trust? To frame it plainly, when did wolves move into our firelight, and why did we let them stay? The logic starts with survival. On the plains where people cut meat, cooked it, and discarded waste, scavengers were inevitable. Bones smeared with fat, scraps of marrow, skin trimmed from hides. These were calories waiting to be eaten. Wolves who stayed close used less energy than those covering vast miles for a hunt. Small gains, but in a cold climate, every calorie was the difference between lean and fat, between survival and exhaustion. From the human side, this relationship held value too. A wolf lingering near camp would bark or growl when unknown movement approached. In thick grass or within pitch nights, such warning yelps functioned as alarm systems. A sudden noise cut through silence in ways human ears may have missed. And those same sharp senses that helped wolves track prey in the wild could, once they neared camp, be borrowed by human hunters. Together, this trade-off made the partnership plausible. Leftovers exchanged for vigilance, access to territory given in return for layered senses. Think of how mutual advantages stack. For wolves, close access meant less risk of failed hunts. For humans, proximity meant awareness, and sometimes guidance on following prey. It may have started with single bold individuals or pairs venturing close to people at rest. It widened through generations as offspring of those wolves grew tolerant of this strange, fire-keeping relative species. Over time, choice selected itself. The animals that could stand near smoke and stillness lived longer in lean years. The humans who kept these tamer companions had ears and teeth added to their group. This step mattered because neither species was weak. Each one had evolved to survive independently. What drew them together was not need, but the efficiency of shared space. We do have traces hinting at how far the bond advanced. In the soil near Bonn Castle in present-day Germany, the remains of a dog were found deliberately buried alongside humans, dated to around 14,000 years ago. That is not a wild animal tossed into a pit. It is a companion laid with care, suggesting that by then wolves were no longer mere scavengers at the edges. They were inside the circle, close enough in role to share human graves. The evidence reaches further than food scraps or tracks, into realm of emotion and ritual. Now bring the question back to something more immediate. Sound. Even a small dog's bark can carry far across the open steppe. With wind as a courier, a call would echo over a kilometre. That reach mattered in vast spaces with no walls, no bells or tools of alarm. Something heard sooner by a canine throat than by human senses gave a margin of time to act, whether to collect children, to lift weapons, to brace for the chase of prey, or scatter against a predator. And yet it is tempting to leave the story as a clean mutual trade, meat for warning. The truth was layered. Through slow seasons, wolves could just as well tip back into being competitors for food. Lines were thin. Not all stayed, not all adapted. The ones who did so became partners. The ones who did not melted back into the wild, sometimes hunted, sometimes eking out a hard life. It was not pet versus wild animal, not a simple division, but an edge where two species tested each other. The wolves who stood the cold nights beside humans learned to survive winters leaner than most other packs could weather. So it was not only a matter of human choice. Wolves also made theirs. They were selecting us at the same time we measured them. Sleeping beside a fire with wolves nearby altered survival in tangible ways. On the most basic level, warmth increased. A phrase has echoed down cultures that grasped the bond. A three-dog night, meaning a cold night where several animals are enough to heat the sleeping group. Imagine bodies pressed together under hides, with fur radiating heat in stillness. For children and elders in particular, extra degrees of warmth could mean the difference between catching frostbite or waking whole. This simple fact may have encouraged not only tolerance but desire to have dogs stay near. Beyond heat, a suite of tools and behaviours began to overlap. Did people strap meat or hides to canids to share in labour as they travelled? Perhaps. They may not yet have been pulling full sleds across landscapes, but even partial hauling must have opened possibilities. Fewer burdens for children or elders meant longer distances for entire groups, and if hunts now included dogs ranging ahead, their noses primed for scent trails, strategies for taking down fleet deer or stubborn bison adjusted. The atlatl, a tool that extended the arm's throw, finds its social counterpart here in canid scouts, an extension of human senses that stretched range beyond our natural body alone. The speculative canopy spreads further still. Companionship may have shifted patterns of safety. When children wandered to the edge of camp, dogs may have shadowed them, providing a layer of defence against sudden predator strikes. Elders who could not keep pace with the speed of the group may still have managed shorter steps if dogs carried small trunks of supplies or lent body heat at night. Myth and mind may have drawn from it too. Wolves had long been figures of fear in landscape and story, sharp-toothed spirits of hunger and cunning. To watch that same form become a partner must have seeded imagination. Canine figures as guides, guardians, omens. From one step above the dark into firelight may have grown new cosmologies, tales of messengers leading souls across thresholds. To see this bond inside a wider frame, lay it beside our earlier survival tools. Clothing was our first skin, shelters our first walls, fire our first clock. Dogs became the first allies outside ourselves. They were not gear, they were not tools. They breathed, chose, and ran alongside. Their presence shifted not only daily rhythm but the spirit of groups. Sharing meat with another species is not small. It marks expansion of community. It says, protection extends beyond human bonds. Watch then the shift in symbolic acts. When animals are not only eaten but buried, it reflects transition from resource to relation. Burials at human sides placed dogs beside their caretakers, for reasons extending beyond utility. A shared hunt ties species together in work. A shared grave ties them further into memory. This act signals respect or even love across the barrier of form. Few ideas are more radical in deep time than this, recognizing partnership with another predator. If this was not pet and master, it was something stranger. Close to equal predators, feeling the push of hunger and weather, found paths that braided survival together. They allowed selves into each other's stories. Each brought strengths, the scent, the hearing, the bark carried far, the fire, the spear, the will to share food. Both sides traded small losses for greater gain. Out of this came one of the most consequential relationships in prehistory. So you can imagine the scene again. A family crouched at their hearth, and beyond them, in the half-shadow, not stranger's eyes anymore, but a recognized sentinel. In time, that stranger ate from the hand, lay among them, and was given rest when life ended. If clothing was our first skin, then dogs were our first allies, senses and courage on loan across dark plains. So you stand with a companion who will watch while you sleep and run when you rise. But a watchful friend does not pierce a hide. For that, you'll need a way to throw farther than fear and strike before hooves arrive. How did we learn to do that? How did humans, small as we are, bring down creatures that towered over us, mammoths, bison, and giant deer that outweighed a single hunter 50 to 1? That question lingers because it seems impossible. The image of a lone figure pressing against such a beast with only a pointed stick does not hold. What worked here was not raw strength against raw strength, but a careful balance of tools, leverage, teamwork, and patience stretched over long hours in wind and snow. The first weapon was the spear, yet even that simple form grew into something far more sophisticated across the Ice Age. A sharpened stone point fixed onto a shaft could thrust at close range, but hunters needed more distance. From that need came one of the most elegant inventions of its time, the atlatl. Picture a short stick carved and shaped, a groove cut so that the butt of a spear fitted snugly into it. With a flick of the arm, this extension acted like a lever, hurling the spear faster and farther than muscle alone could provide. The principle is the same as using a long wrench instead of a short one. You multiply the force. What might have been a clumsy throw now became a piercing strike aimed with control. This extra reach mattered because prey of the Ice Age was not only large but dangerous. A mammoth could trample and gore. A bison could scatter hunters in seconds. Closing within arm's length meant near certain death. The atlatl allowed a hunter to stand back, hurling a weapon strong enough to pierce hide and muscle, while keeping distance from tusks and hooves. And as with everything in Ice Age life, one hunter was rarely enough. Cooperation defined the chase. Picture a group surrounding a herd, pressing from multiple sides, flushing animals toward chosen terrain, an icy ravine, a muddy patch, or simply toward a line of armed figures waiting. Spears arched through the air together, multiple wounds tiring the animal until it slowed, stumbled, and fell. But the spear itself tells a deeper story. At first, points were large, chipped from stone into edges sharp but brittle. Over time, smaller blades were hafted into grooves on wooden shafts. These were microliths, minute stone inserts shaped with care, then glued in sequence to create a longer cutting edge. Imagine a row of small teeth lined up, each one sharpened, bound together to function as something stronger than the sum of its parts. If one fractured on impact, the rest still cut. And this was not stone jammed bare into wood. Adhesives, bitumen, plant resins, and mixtures blended with ash were heated and applied to hold the tools firm. It was chemistry in its earliest form, practiced by observation and memory. A spear with a hafted point could penetrate thick hide. With microlith blades along its edge, it could tear further with each movement. Coupled with the atlatl's speed, the result was a weapon capable of real damage against vast animals. This combination of physics, engineering and teamwork tipped the balance just enough for human survival. Each kill supplied not only meat, but hides for clothing, bones for building, sinew for thread, and fat for fire. Hunting, then, was an ecosystem of its own, feeding every other part of life. Think of the timing required. A group had to move as one body, each person trusting the other to maintain the line, to release weapons at the right interval, to press the herd in the chosen direction. One mistake could scatter prey into open steppe, where speed carried them beyond reach, or worse, send them charging back through the hunters themselves. That level of coordination did not come by chance. It trained itself into culture, stories, lessons at the fire, so by the time a youth held their first atlatl, they knew the movements, the sounds, the rhythm of the group. Once you start to view these tools not as relics but as active solutions, you see how inventive Ice Age humans were under pressure. Take the choice of materials. Not every stone could be chipped into the thin, tough shape needed for blades. Flint, obsidian, chert. Different conditions offered different stones, and hunters learned to seek out quarries even if it meant long walks or trade across groups. To secure certain points, they had to journey, exchange, or maintain memory of seasonal routes. A single spear point, then, might carry within it days of searching or bonds between families who traded resources. Fire also played a role. Heat-treating stones made them flake more predictably. Warming resins softened them to glue microliths tight. Flames hardened wooden shafts to strengthen and straighten them. Each step in weapon making required planning. Each improvement raised the chance of food on the next hunt. Behind every mammoth tusk lifted from the earth, there was a chain of countless small refinements, as deliberate as any slow workshop today. The animals themselves shaped weapons too. When facing steppe bison, hunters needed speed and multiple strikes. Against a woolly mammoth, heavier spears and sharper thrusts were necessary, aimed at vulnerable spots. Weapons were not general tools. They were tailored to prey, adapted by trial and memory across generations. When you picture the Ice Age, do not see a single spear used everywhere. See an arsenal of points, shafts, composites, and throwing sticks modified to the environment's demand. And remember stealth. A straight rush at a herd was folly. Hunters tracked wind to mask scent, crept low across ridges, or drew animals toward pitfalls and bogs. Tools made distance safer, but strategy made success possible. The pattern is clear. Hunting was not a brute struggle, but a stream of decisions, tokens of shared experience, and technology sharpened against time. What does that mean for us? Simply this. Ice Age hunters reshaped their place in the food chain not by muscle, but by leverage, physical with the atlatl, mental with planning, and social with group trust. Alone, we lack the power to bring down giants. Together with tools extending arm's reach, we altered the rules of survival. With weapons crafted from stone, wood, sinew, and resin, launched by human hands through levers of bone or wood, Ice Age humans wrote themselves into the role of top predator across grasslands. It is a reminder that the edge of survival often depends on small innovations. A groove carved in a stick, a stone chipped a little finer, a group moving in sync. With these, people carved food and fuel out of landscapes that seemed stacked against them. With leverage and teamwork, giants could fall, and yet, the hunt was only one half of the story. Because beyond the clash of spears and the thunder of hooves lay the world itself, a frozen stage of ice sheets and vast plains of grass. To understand daily life, we must step back from the weapons and look at the landscape they were built for. What did the world look like when the ice held its breath at full stretch? Not the scattered glaciers we see in today's mountains, but walls of frozen mass pressing down upon whole continents. Mile-thick ice sheets burdened the northern half of North America, heavy enough to grind valleys flat and push the crust of the earth itself downward. Europe lay under the same weight, its rivers redirected, its forests smothered, its soils frozen into silence. To imagine it, picture the planet in deep storage, vast blocks of ice sitting like immeasurable lids shut against the land beneath, and yet, and here is the surprise, this age of weight and white was also an age of grass. Just beyond the frozen domes, stretching across Eurasia into Alaska, spread one of the largest ecological stages Earth has ever known. People call it the mammoth steppe, though it carried far more than mammoths. Grasses, sedges, and hardy herbs covered immense plains, rich with wildflowers in spring, windswept gold in autumn, icy but alive in winter. Here woolly rhinoceros grazed, bison pawed at frozen soil, reindeer made their circuits, and smaller creatures tunneled through roots. It was the border between death-grip cold and a living pantry. To step out of the ice's shadow was to walk into the heart of a grassland that sustained predators and people alike. The contrast cannot be overstated. At one edge, the ice sheet, barren and lethal even to hardy mosses. At the other, the plains, fertile with enough life to sustain giant herds. Daily survival depended on hugging that margin, staying close enough to resources but far enough from the creeping advance of ice. Settlements and camps filled these boundaries, where food moved on four legs and materials could be harvested. In other words, human life was a negotiation with geography itself, drawn tight between extremes. Now let us widen the frame. With so much water locked in ice, seas retreated. Shorelines stepped back, continents grew new edges, and the map we know today would have looked unfamiliar. The waves pulled away from cliffs and beaches, revealing slopes and plains that had lain drowned for ages. Coasts extended outward by the length of whole days' walks. Where we now see islands scattered by sea, these were once joined to the mainland by exposed stretches of land. The oceans did not vanish, but they thinned and dropped, lower by what would now measure as 100 meters. That is no small puddle. It reshaped entire hemispheres. The most dramatic revelations were the land bridges. One of them, wide as a country, lay between Siberia and Alaska. Today, that link is drowned beneath the Bering Strait, but then it was Beringia, grassland, rivers, and low hills swept by cold, yet rich with life. Herd animals crossed it, predators trailed behind, and eventually human footprints pressed into its mud and frost. To stand there was to stand not on sea floor nor on island, but on a bridge welded by climate, holding two continents together for a time. Other crossings formed elsewhere too, shelves between islands and coasts, corridors across what is now the English Channel or the shallow North Sea. Many of these are gone beneath waves again, but once they were highways. Think of the Earth itself wearing a heavy winter jacket. Plates of ice stitched together across much of the north, seams drawn tight, folds pulling seas down into storage. Like a coat that both shields and burdens, it wrapped the world, lining shoulders with glaciers, tightening around its waist with shrunken oceans. The image is not poetic dressing, but a literal pattern. The planet insulated by stored water, draped in an outfit cut by orbital rhythm. Where the jacket sat too tight, life froze. Where gaps at the edges remained, grass and beasts flourished. We should also note the sound of such a world. It was not silent despite the word Ice Age. Grasslands roared with winds sweeping unhindered for hundreds of miles. Herds thundered together, their hooves and horns striking rhythm as they moved. Predators called across valleys, while water rushed and cracked where melting met frozen ground. Only the sheet itself lay under muffled quiet, creaking with its own weight. The world was stitched by opposites. White stillness above, roaring plains beside. The geography shaped human time. Camps sprouted along rivers that cut the steppe. Pathways followed the migratory routes of reindeer or bison. Glaciers were both threat and compass. You could not live upon them, but they told you where grass and prey would cluster at their borders. Daily life was tethered to that knife edge season after season. Some years the ice swelled forward, swallowing valleys in blue frozen mass. Other years it shrank, leaving behind fresh soil and clear meltwater streams. Movement became normality, not exception. Even the animals show us how the land ruled them. Mammoths grazed on hardy plants that grew right at the edge of permafrost. Their bodies held fat stores like living warehouses, tuned to the rhythm of sparse winters and brief summers. Predators like saber-toothed cats and cave lions shadowed herd migrations, their own ranges extending and bending around the edges of ice. Nothing lived upon the massive white domes. Everything clustered in the grass belt where resources and opportunity remained. What stands out is how people across this world never inhabited an ice desert. They lived in grasslands exposed by retreating seas, in valleys opened where meltwater drained, and in low shelters pressed into tundra soil. It was not frozen emptiness that framed their homes. It was the living edge. The Ice Age was real, but its daily texture was steppe, not glacier. Imagine, then, waking each morning to that sight. Horizon to horizon, bands of grass rippling in wind, wandering herds visible in the distance, and the endless white wall looming farther north. That was the stage on which their tools, shelters, and clothing came into play. The hunt stretched across plains. Neighbours met on shared routes, and the resources of survival, stone, bone, water, hide, were harvested where ice gave way to ground. So in simple terms, the ice ruled, but life thrived in its shadow. We measure the period by glaciers, yet for those who lived it, the central world was grass. The mammoth steppe was the dining hall, the workplace, the crossroads. It was the true landscape of daily life, while the ice sheet was merely the backdrop of threat. That is the payoff to remember. The Ice Age did not mean living on ice. It meant finding subsistence and community just outside its grasp. From the stark face of glaciers and the wide plains they guarded, we turn now to the most curious part of that story, the beings who walked within this borderland. Because we were not its only travellers. Other humans stood there too, building fires of their own, shaping tools of their own, and leaving traces in our blood long after the ice had eased. Who else walked this frozen world with us? We tend to imagine our own species alone against the cold, but the truth is more layered. On the long plains and in the shadows of caves, other kinds of humans moved through the same wind and snow. They lit fires, stitched hides, raised children, and followed herds just as we did. And for a time, they were neighbours, not ghosts. In Europe lived the Neanderthals, a branch with bodies shorter and stronger, faces shaped by generations of cold survival. Across Asia were others, less familiar to us, the Denisovans. Much of what we know of them comes only from fragments, a piece of jaw, a finger bone, traces of DNA whispering of a presence once widespread. And into this world stepped Homo sapiens, our own line, spreading outward from earlier homelands and mixing across terrain already long occupied. It raises the question, when they met, were they rivals locked in competition, strangers keeping wary distance, or something closer to kin? Archaeology alone paints an incomplete picture. Stone tools left side by side in some layers suggest overlap in land use. Burial sites hint at shared habits, and genetic traces, the chemical imprints that linger in us, add another voice. What the evidence makes clear is that encounters were not rare accidents at the edges. Genes from Neanderthals remain in many populations today, shaping traits such as immune response and skin adaptation to cold climates. It means meeting was close, human to human, and intimate enough to leave lineages. Denisovan markers, though harder to find, persist more strongly in groups around Southeast Asia and Oceania. This points to multiple threads of contact, moments when our species did not just borrow space from others, but mixed and carried pieces of each forward. Think of it like layers of ashen soil in a riverbank. Each layer rests atop the previous, but fragments from older floods still shape what grows there now. Our genetic map works that way. In you, there may be fragments that once belonged to Neanderthals trudging across a frozen valley. In others, pieces that trace back to Denisovan hunters scaling mountain ridges. These markers are not curiosities. They remain alive, influencing everything from resistance to disease to how bodies adapt to altitude or cold. And yet, sharing genes does not mean harmony defined every meeting. Life at the edge of ice was pressed tight by scarcity. Food meant survival. Territory meant safer passage. The archaeological record suggests both cooperation and conflict. Competition in some valleys where resources narrowed, coexistence in others where groups lingered together. Imagine two camps set a day's walk apart, each with its fire crackling, each listening across the open night to distant voices drifting on the wind. Sometimes people frame this in sharp contrasts, our line clever and theirs declining. But that is too simple. Neanderthals shaped flint into blades as fine as ours, mastered fire, buried their dead, and likely sang or carved symbols we simply have not preserved. Denisovans left fewer traces, but we see their strength layered into high mountain populations today. These humans were not simple outliers. They were kin, close enough to share existence, separate enough to stand as their own lineages. Picture a shared hunt. A group waits beside a river where caribou are known to pass. Another arrives, carrying similar tools, watching from across the current. Do they scatter in competition, risking wounds and empty hands? Or do they wait together, splitting the labour of the chase, each group carrying kills back to separate fires? We cannot say in full detail, but both outcomes are plausible, and both remind us the Ice Age was crowded with more than one kind of intelligence. Now layer in the human sense of story. Imagine strangers by the light of fire, their words foreign but their eyes, gestures and laughter recognisably human. A Neanderthal hand might have passed a flint core to a sapien's hand. A Denisovan voice might have joined in a group song. DNA tells us that barriers broke down, however rarely or however quietly, leaving descents that still speak inside us. That is the campfire image worth holding. On some nights, firelight stretched across differences, even as on others it marked boundaries. This makes the Ice Age not a lone struggle of us against the wild, but a human landscape in plural. We were one branch among several, intersecting across thousands of years. Out of these networks of contact, rivalry and mixture, our particular story continued. Theirs did not, at least not as distinct lines. But absence does not mean erasure, because traces run through our marrow still. There is a sober lesson in this. The Neanderthals, built so strongly for the cold, did not outlast the cycles that followed. Denisovans, with ranges extending from caves to plateaus, faded into genetic whispers. Yet through interbreeding, through those shared campfires, parts of them bypassed extinction by folding into us. Their fate fused with ours, leaving us carriers of their endurance. We might think of it as threads woven into fabric. Alone, a thread may fray. Woven into fresh cloth, it strengthens the whole. In that sense, we carry not only our own lineage but theirs as well, woven invisibly into the cloth of humanity that walked forward when the ice retreated. Standing back, you see the pattern. We ask what Ice Age humans wore, built, hunted, ate, but also who they met, and how those meetings live inside our very cells. Evidence tells us that the Ice Age was social, not just within groups, but across species, bands overlapping on shared maps, boundaries blurred even as differences marked each community. And the map wasn't only bodies and firesides, it was threads, gifts, stories, obligations, pulled taut across valleys. Before we follow the fur and tusk, let's trace those threads, how a small bead could carry a promise farther than any voice. You lift a shell bead far from any sea and pause. Its smooth surface carries the polish of water and waves, but here no tide has reached in thousands of miles. Someone, you realise, carried this. Maybe for you, maybe not. The bead is small, it weighs almost nothing, yet its presence is heavy with meaning. It travelled through hands from one camp to another, across valleys and grasslands. It was never only an ornament, it was evidence of a thread that ran between scattered groups on the steppe. A thread woven not from hide or sinew, but from trust and shared need. The question is, how wide did these networks spread, and what truly moved within them? Stone tells us the reach. Obsidian tools, volcanic glass sharp enough to slice flesh with little effort, turn up far from their sources. In some cases, those sources are hundreds of kilometers away. A flint blade lying beside a mammoth-bone hearth may contain the distant glitter of a ridge far beyond today's horizon. High-quality stone was worth moving across ground that seemed empty and brutal. Carrying it built an unspoken economy, not driven by coins or ledgers, but by need and foresight. The same is true for marine shells resting in camps placed deep inland. A child's burial with string shells speaks of journeys that linked ocean edges to plains where herds roamed. And then there is ochre, the iron-rich earth used as pigment. It stains bones, beads, hides. Pits of ochre appear in valleys, their bright powders carried away to become body paint, grave colour, or marking on stone walls in caverns far from the quarry. None of these materials walked on their own legs. They show how people moved them, handed them, and wanted them shared. Some of the richest finds come from Sungir in Russia. Graves there carried not scraps but thousands of beads meticulously carved and strung together into garments. Each bead took hours to make, weeks of steady handwork. To wear them meant displaying the work of many lives, not one. That scale hints at a web of exchange, with people labouring together to create ornament that outlived any single meal. In Gravettian Europe more broadly, materials appear in places where natural sources do not exist, suggesting that a wide net of movement and exchange stretched from valley to valley. The diffusion of objects across Europe speaks not of closed camps but of links, connections so steady that even in frozen winds people thought it worth carrying fragile beads and powders across distances we would hesitate to walk. One odd but telling piece of this system comes from ostrich eggshell beads. Far from tundras, in Africa and the Levant, the shells of ostrich eggs were broken, shaped, drilled and strung together. Their making became a tradition older than many other crafts. A bead was not only ornament, it could work as a token, a marker of identity, a piece that signalled who you were to those who met you. Strings of them may have served as portable stories, tracks of family or group identity that could be shown and carried. To send such a bead outward, to hand it to another, may have been a way of ensuring a bond stretched beyond one season or one hunt. So it becomes clear these exchanges were not markets. They lacked stalls, currency, and written contracts, yet they were not isolation either. Between them ran another form of economy, gifts against chance, tokens against uncertainty. If one winter pressed a group to the edge of famine, partners from elsewhere could matter. Maybe shells were carried as signs of those partnerships, gifts marking a bond, a way of saying, we are tied, we remember, and we may call. When little divided survival from collapse, giving was a guarantee. Think of it as storing calories not in a pit of dried meat, but in someone else's memory miles away. Because goods moved, but so did knowledge. Routes across mountains, herd timings across plains, safe passes where ice could be crossed, warnings of storms or unrest. All these bits of memory were cargo in themselves. A shell necklace might weigh little, but to string it could take hundreds of hours. Dozens, even hundreds of beads required smooth grinding, threading, carving. That labour spoke of patience, of a high cost stored in one necklace. When given, it meant more than beauty. It meant time had been invested, and that time carried weight when offered. Such objects then transmitted labour as well as style, and with them likely came words, directions, stories, names, passed around the fire as the beads passed through hands. Speculation suggests these beads and ornaments carried codes of belonging. Maybe some strings marked group identity, the particular cut or polish showing you were from one valley, not another. Perhaps wearing certain colours or bead numbers signalled permissions like travel passes along a route. In our age we speak of passports, badges, cards. In theirs, it may have been the gleam of shells at a throat, the streak of ochre across a cheek. To arrive among strangers wearing the shared markers might have made the difference between shelter offered or risk at spear point. The social meaning unfolds from there. Picture a camp near a river, smoke streaming from hearths. Around its edges sit visitors from another group. They trade flint, hand over ochre, but the talk goes further. Future hunts are mapped on the ground with pointed sticks. Marriages are arranged, linking families across valleys so blood ties secure the partnership. Songs cross languages, carrying the weight of shared myth. The gifts exchanged are not idle. They are contracts in the absence of writing. Each bead, each shell, each bag of ochre stitches camps into a map of obligation. That map stretched wider than we often imagine. Hunters packed with meat met gatherers rich in seeds. Fishers from rivers deep inland found shell beads from distant coasts. The threads run like rivers, linking far-flung bands into a fabric of reliance. The beads, the shells, the ochre, they were not ends but carriers of meaning. They marked friends, alliances, commitments. They stitched human lives into a mesh, so when winds turned cruel, the net could catch those who fell against its strands. Think about what is carried when one person lifts a shell bead and passes it on. The bead itself is nothing extraordinary compared to the demands of survival. You cannot eat it. You cannot clothe yourself in it. But it tells a story. It says someone walked to the sea, stooped, picked it up, shaped it, threaded it, carried it inland, gave it in trust. To wear it was to wear a trail of journeys and conversations. The artifact holds weight not for what it is, but for the paths it represents, each segment binding one being to another across deep time. The odd fact remains, networks reached far. Obsidian flakes in places without volcanoes, shells in river valleys, ochre in lands with no red earth. Each item whispers of travel, collaboration and necessity. We may ask what motivated them to carry an exchange. The answer seems to lean less on riches and more on insurance. Surviving winters meant layering protections, not simply hides and shelters, but also alliances. Carrying goods outward built expectation of return. In this sense, gifts were deposits, debts, even currency rooted not in law but in memory. And yet, the true traffic here was not goods. It was trust. Across frozen plains where food vanished for weeks, you needed more than one camp's safety net. A necklace of beads could be a badge that admitted you into another's fire circle when your own food ran out. A pouch of ochre might cement a promise. A sharp flint obtained from far away might cut meat, but also cut distance, reminding you that your ties stretched further than your own valley. So when we think about Ice Age trade, we need to slow down and imagine its reality. It was no caravan of packed animals, no long trains of wagons. It was small transfers repeated again and again, bead by bead, flake by flake, building a system as firm and enduring as any road. Those items stitched people together, but unseen behind them moved information, loyalties, kinship. Networks of exchange kept memory alive just as fire kept warmth alive. A bead here, a shell there, tokens in hand. Yet they matter because they reveal what people knew. Survival required sharing, and sharing required marks of belonging. Across the steppe, goods moved, but the real cargo was trust. Connection was a technology, but so were the herds themselves, great engines keeping the plains open. To see why these networks could exist at all, we have to step into the age of giants. Why did giant mammals rise to such heights, only to vanish so suddenly? That question sits heavy when you stand in the presence of their bones. 1 century, herds of mammoths and woolly rhinos roamed from plain to horizon. The next, only smaller survivors remained, while their colossal kin slipped away. The Ice Age, which sustained them for ages, seemed to pull the ground from under their feet. And we must ask, why did creatures so powerful become so fragile? On the mammoth steppe, life was abundant but shaped to extremes. Mammoths swept their tusks to clear snow, exposing the grasses beneath. Woolly rhinos carried thick coats and massive horns used not just for defense, but for scraping into frozen ground. Saber-toothed cats lay in wait, their long teeth specialized for puncturing thick hides. Each was crafted by climate and plain, suited precisely to a world ruled by grass and ice. Their very size was their survival strategy. Carry reserves of fat, generate warmth through scale, harvest vast amounts of hardy plants. For thousands of years their bodies matched the land, and yet, when conditions tipped, their strength became weakness. As the climate warmed, glaciers melted back, wetlands spread where frozen grasslands once stood. Forests edged outward, bringing trees in place of sedges and steppe herbs. For smaller grazers, variety meant opportunity. But for giants tuned to endless grass plains, habitats began to shrink. A woolly mammoth bred for high-fibre diets could not easily adapt when meadows gave way to woodland patches. A saber-toothed cat, optimized for taking down immense prey, fared less well when herds thinned and smaller animals dominated. Their niches tightened until entire species faced decline. And yet warming alone doesn't explain the suddenness. If climate change were the only factor, some of these giants might have lingered longer. This is where another force steps in: human hunters. Armed with atlatls and coordinated strategies, groups could pierce even the defences of a massive mammoth. Evidence suggests that people did not need to kill herds outright to tip the scales. Even low hunting pressure, spread across centuries, could stress populations already strained by shrinking grasslands. A balance long maintained between herds and plains began to wobble. Picture ecosystems as engines. Mammoths kept grasslands open, trampling young trees, spreading seeds through dung, cycling nutrients in ways subtle but constant. Remove many of them, and grass gave way to brush and shrub. Woolly rhinos broke crusted snow, creating paths that other grazers followed. Saber-toothed cats maintained checks on herd growth. Each giant was not just a consumer, but a maintainer, a moving gear in a machine. Take them out, and the system shifted into new states. What once held steady slipped toward new forms of balance that no longer held room for these titans. We can think of their loss as both natural and assisted. Nature tested them through warming cycles, demanding flexibility they could not always offer. Humans, meanwhile, pressed from below, nibbling at numbers year by year. Perhaps no single spear felled the last mammoth. Instead, gradual attrition, paired with climate sliding beneath their feet, made survival untenable. The end came not as one blow, but as stress accumulated where biology met environment and where environment met us. Now pause and consider how sudden that would have felt to the human standing then. For tens of generations, mammoths were constant. They gave hides, tusks, meat, bone. They marked the horizon with their movement. Then, year by year, they grew scarcer. Hunts failed more often. Trails grew cold. Stories must have shifted as elders explained that the great beasts no longer came. For predators that had defined myth and shaped daily risk, their absence must have felt like a breach in the order of the world. And yet their echoes remain etched in more than memory. Hides lined dwellings. Tusks carved by hands became art, tools, and ornament. Bones formed walls. While living, they sustained cultures. In death, their remains still built homes and objects. Giants became axles of community, their bodies woven into human survival right up until the brink of disappearance. Was it inevitable? That question has no simple answer. Climate cycles had toppled large animals before. Extinctions are old rhythms in deep time. But the overlap of warming with human expansion created a crucible. Remove one force, perhaps some giants would still walk among us. Remove both, and many more might have persisted. But with both, strain outpaced recovery. Populations could not rebound, and in geological moments, they thinned to silence. You might imagine an open plain stripped of its usual thunder. Where herds once shook the earth with their passing, silence held. Brush grew taller. Local populations of reindeer or smaller grazers filled gaps but lacked the force to sculpt land as mammoths had. Predators like saber-toothed cats, bereft of large prey, dwindled. The great engine stopped, pieces clattering loose, ecosystems remaking themselves around emptiness. In that gap, forests marched northward, coastlines shifted with rising seas, and grassland kingdoms collapsed. The Ice Age giants were not mere curiosities of scale. They were engines, large bodies converting energy from grass into movement, warmth, and fertility in soil. When they fell, landscapes transformed. That is the takeaway. Their disappearance is not just about creatures vanishing from sight, but about entire environments reshuffling as a result. The mammoth steppe ended not with ice, but with absence. And still, even now, their fingerprints remain. Permafrost soils hold tusks and bones, locked in frozen memory. Myths from many cultures describe enormous creatures of fur and horn, echoes carried down long after extinction. Conservation debates today sometimes even whisper about restoring elements of these systems, using proxies like modern elephants to echo what mammoths once did. Whether those efforts can succeed is uncertain, but the very idea shows we still feel their loss. In the end, the fate of giants was tied to precision. They thrived when the climate held stable, when grass stretched wide, when herds reinforced the land that fed them. But when change came, warmer forests, human hunters, the tight fit between body and world unravelled. They were immense animals, but fragile when the world bent away from them. That fragility led to disappearance, leaving only fragments in ice and stone. So the mini payoff is this. The giants of the Ice Age were not random excess, they were keystones of their ecosystems. They kept land open, shaped migration, fueled predator and prey alike. But like great machines fine-tuned to one setting, they could not hold balance when conditions tipped. And when they fell, their departure rewrote the stage of life itself. From those vanishing giants, our focus turns back to humans, because as the world staggered through warming, shrinking herds and altered landscapes, People faced a familiar dilemma: adapt or follow the same path as the creatures they once relied upon. And that meant movement, risk, and journeys into unfamiliar ground. How did people cross a frozen world when oceans had pulled back their waters? The maps of that time would not look like ours. The seas had shrunk, shorelines had shifted, and whole landscapes that are now drowned lay open to the air. For those walking then, the routes into new worlds were revealed not as bridges built, but as land uncovered by ice and tide. The story of migration in the Ice Age was not one single path, but many open doors, each appearing and closing over short spans of time. One of the most striking of those doors was Beringia. It was not a narrow bridge, as sometimes pictured, but an entire landscape of tundra and grassland stretching between Siberia and Alaska. Rivers threaded through it. Herds moved across it. People could linger on it, not simply rush across. What is ocean now was once dry ground, firm enough for reindeer and mammoths to pass, and broad enough for their human trackers to settle in camps season after season. To travel there was to walk on a floor of seafloor, a place both temporary and vital. But Beringia was only one example of how climate rewrote the map. Far to the south, in what we now know as the Sahara, climate rhythms turned desert into grassland at intervals. Rainfall shifted, rivers cut fresh channels through sand, lakes filled, and corridors of green appeared where we now imagine only dunes. These green windows could stay open long enough for people to cross vast regions that would otherwise have been impossible. Once the rains retreated, sand returned and corridors dimmed away. If you moved during the open spell, you could cross. If you waited too long, the gate closed. The same pattern affected Europe's north. Where the North Sea now swells between Britain and mainland Europe, Ice Age people walked over exposed plains we now call Doggerland. It was not peripheral land, but living ground. Grass and animals filled it. Hunters moved across it to reach new areas that later would become cut off by floods. Imagine standing now on that seabed, water rolling above your head, but then standing on grass instead, herds moving across it with trails carved into ancient soil. Each shift of sea made whole geographies appear and vanish. This is the tension to grasp. The routes people relied on did not hold steady for more than a handful of centuries. Glaciers advanced and retreated. Seas rose and fell. Corridors of green or land pulled from the waves opened, then shut. A family could pass through one generation, while their grandchildren found only water or desert where roads had once stretched. Migration was not a single moment of discovery, but a rolling puzzle, a shifting game of openings and closures. So how did humans adapt? Some followed the inland paths as they appeared. They shadowed rivers, drank from reshaping lakes, and crossed plains when grass took hold. Others pressed along coasts using rafts, driftwood boats, or anything buoyant enough to follow shorelines where fish and shellfish provided steady food. Boats were as old as the need to explore water's edge. To hug a coast was to step outside the risk of deserts or frozen interiors, and to move as long as the sea lay low enough to let that narrow band of land guide them. This duality shaped our spread. Some groups walked inland corridors, holding close to herds and freshwater. Others touched the boundaries of the ocean itself, coasting silently along beaches that no longer exist. Together, these twin strategies threaded humanity outward from the Ice Age heartlands into lands we still occupy. Migration was not choice alone. It was forced by climate, demanded by shifting resource lines, compelled by the sudden appearance of passable routes. Think of Earth's climate as a door that swings in slow time. Every 1,000 years or so it eased open or slammed shut. People waited near its hinges, listening for the creak. When the gap appeared, steps pressed through. When it closed, they carried memory of what lay beyond, but saw no way to return. In this way, climate acted as gatekeeper. deciding what maps were passable when. For those who walked then, each movement across these doors meant risk. To cross a green Sahara meant timing. The monsoon rains gave passage, but fail to move quickly enough and drought would strand you. To walk Beringia required endurance, fire and clothing tough enough for frozen wind. Coastal routes asked trust in waters, the ability to patch vessels and read tides. No migration was easy, but each new path spread not only humans but ideas, tools and memory into new reaches. The payoff is clear. Forced by climate, these journeys carried humans farther than herds could alone. Across Asia into the Americas, across Africa into Eurasia, across flooded shelves that now lie beneath waves. It was not a march of conquest, but of necessity, nudged forward each time seas fell or rains carved new estuaries, and each crossing left descendants who carried pieces of older worlds into new ones. Pause here and notice the scale. What seems immense to us, a whole ocean receding hundreds of feet, was background for them. They lived in it, moved through its edges, and adapted without map or forecast. Doors opened, doors closed. They navigated by what the land in front of them allowed. That is what the Ice Age migrations remind us of. Flexibility was as vital as fire or shelter. Our ancestors could not dictate the map, but they could read it, move with it, and survive the disappearances and appearances of land itself. Migration was not random wandering, but precision tuned to climate's rhythm. And when those migrations ended, what came next was the great turning point. Because eventually, the ice that had held back water began to retreat in earnest. Seas that had exposed shelves and corridors rose again, swallowing Doggerland, drowning coastal camps, flooding rivers back into new beds. Grass that had painted the Sahara green withered as desert returned. The known routes sealed, and those who had walked them found themselves in permanently altered worlds. So the migrations through open doors were both expansion and closing chapters. They spread humans onto new continents, rearranged populations and gave us our range. But they also relied on windows of time that did not stay open. We are left with traces, submerged valleys, drowned plains, mud buried beneath waves that tell us where the doors once swung. Before we step into the thaw, there's one more road to walk, the narrow band where land meets sea. When herds faltered inland, some people turned to tides and kelp forests. Were shorelines the superhighways of the Ice Age? Low tide, thick ribbons of kelp sway like slow banners at the edge of the sea. You drag a small skin boat up over wet sand. Its frame creaks softly. Nets hang nearby, glistening with fish still sticky from salt spray. On a rack above the high water mark, gutted strips of salmon stiffen in the breeze, drying for weeks. You step between tide pools. Small crabs scuttle into shadow. It's a scene that could unfold almost anywhere in the Pleistocene, the ocean's edge as kitchen, as workshop, as road. Why would hunters of the Ice Age turn to such margins? The answer lies in predictability. Herds of mammoth or bison were rich in calories, but they moved with seasons, and when they disappeared, hunger followed close. The seashore, in contrast, held food that renewed itself every tide. Shellfish clung to rocks in clusters, mussels layered thick, kelp forests hid schools of fish, seabirds nested by the thousands, and in colder waters, seals rolled along the surf. For a group looking to anchor its survival, this was a pantry stocked by the moon. It offered protein year-round. People did not need to count on the long chase of hooves only. They tapped into the quiet, regular pulse of the shore. Some archaeologists frame this pattern as a possible kelp highway, noting that the shallow, nearshore ecosystems created long bands of food stretching along coasts. Whether or not movement followed this ribbon in a direct line, the idea helps us picture coasts not as obstacles but as corridors. This becomes clearer when we remember how much of those coasts are now hidden. At the height of the last glacial maximum, sea level stood about 120 meters lower than they do today. The beaches people worked, the bays where they dried their fish, the camps pitched in dunes, all of those are drowned now. When ice melted and oceans swelled, sites that told the story of coastal life slipped under the surf. We have only a few glimpses left. Still, on land that remained dry, pieces surface, traces from South America, like Monteverde in Chile, that suggest people had already reached far down the continent earlier than many once thought. That opens a possibility that the shoreline itself was one of the fastest and most reliable routes into new worlds. Part of this picture lies not only in the food taken, but in how it powered other parts of life. Think of oil lamps again. If you live inland, fat for a lamp had to come from large prey, a bison or reindeer broken down into parts. Along the sea, fat was easier. Seal oil, fish oil, or the thick blubber from marine mammals could be melted and stored, keeping flames alight for long nights. A shell or a carved dish could hold weeks of burn. That light extended work into darkness, kept warmth alive, and in its glow allowed new stories to gather. Where trees were sparse, another gift drifted ashore. Logs thrown to sea by rivers or broken from coastal forests, washed up, dried, smoother, easier to burn. A single piece of driftwood could supply fuel to a camp that had no other access to trunks, strengthening the link between ocean and survival. For coast people, the tide was not only fishing ground but woodshed, lantern oil store and highway all in one. And yet the shore was not a rival to the interior plains. Think of it less as one path versus another, more like belt and suspenders. When herds passed through in numbers, inland sites filled with feasting, hides piled high for clothing and tools. But when weather turned harsh, or migration shifted, the coast offered a fallback. The line of surf guaranteed mussels at low tide, fish in pooled shallows, and birds diving from above. Families that switched between these zones had a margin of safety in unstable climates. Redundancy, one food source backing another, created resilience. We should not imagine a sharp division between sea people and land people. Instead, most groups balance both edges, pressing one when the other failed. Such flexibility needed tools. Moving on, water required boats, though wood for planks was never assured. Where trees grew thick enough for logs, dugouts may have been carved, hollowed with fire, smoothed with stone tools. Where trunks were small or absent, animal hides stretched over light frames offered another form. Picture a curved skeleton of ribs bound with sinew, skin pulled tight over it, sealed with fat. These skin-on-frame boats were light, carried easily, and repaired when torn. Simple paddles could move them along coastlines or across rivers. Against currents, fish traps placed with stake and stone steered shoals into narrow pockets. Bone or antler harpoons tipped with barbs, lashed to cords, took seals or larger fish. Hooks carved from shell, tied with fibre, caught smaller species. At every level, technology adapted to tides and waves. Now imagine movement. Inland, walking across tundra valleys took days of trudging over bare soil and wind. On water, if the sea was calm and craft sound, coasts might let groups track hundreds of kilometres in a season, beaching often, gathering shellfish, drying fish along the way. The shoreline was both road and rest stop. Because tides follow rhythm, spawning runs came on schedule, and families may have tied their yearly travel to these events, returning when salmon swam up rivers or when seals hauled out to rest. Routes like this become seasonal circuits, repeating, predictable. It is not hard to imagine that along these bands of food and motion, ideas moved too. Songs, techniques, materials. The coast was as much a network of thought as of bodies. Here comes the human side of this geography. Sometimes groups lived inland for months or years, chasing herds, crafting tools of stone drawn from high ridges. Others spent more time near water, eating mussels, weaving nets and storing oil. When the two met, exchange could follow. Shells are found far inland, bright pigments too, suggesting stretches of trade. The edge dwellers brought messages of the sea, shells that rattled in dances, ideas of nets and traps, oils for lamps. Those from plains carried points and hides. In landscapes where survival tipped on balance, the messenger role was priceless. Each side expanded the other's world. If we pause here, a broad picture emerges. Inland, wide mammals roamed. On coasts, steady offerings came with each tide. Rather than choose one, many groups layered both. This layering created resilience, let them spread farther, and supported their push into new continents. That way of living reinforces a larger principle. In unstable climates, survival often comes not from specialization, but from mixing strategies. The coast, therefore, was not fringe, it was spine. Add to this the way coasts changed. As the Ice Age thawed, some safe harbours drowned and familiar camps vanished. What had been racks of fish sank as sea advanced. Weirs built of stone flooded into reefs. Places thick with shells became sandbars. Yet each disappearance did not erase the memory. Families shifted upward to higher ground, carrying techniques forward. Even if the land drowned behind them, the knowledge of how to fish, trap, and travel by water carried into future generations. In that sense, though the coastline changed, the road remained. So as we stand now, looking back across maps of low seas and wide beaches, we can ask again, were these shorelines the superhighways of the Ice Age? They were places of food that pulsed with the tides, stages for trade and story, bridges for oil and wood, safe fallback when herds moved on. For humans on the edge of survival, that was as close to a highway as the Ice Age world could offer. Where ice ruled the high ground, water drew the roads, and when the ice let go, those roads drowned. Fish racks became shoals, weirs turned to reefs, camps slipped under the rising edge of the sea. Now the map changes again. The thaw and the turning. Ice melted, seas rose, rivers swelled and poured over their banks. For the people who had lived with ice as a constant horizon for generations, this was not a slow, hidden change. It remade the ground under their feet. Valleys that once carried dust and frozen soil turned lush. Wetlands spread where tundra had been. Instead of mile-high walls of glacial ice hemming them in, landscapes opened, filling with streams, ponds, and fertile soil. The world was shifting from a frozen expanse towards something new, and with each shift, daily life had to bend as well. Before, survival on the mammoth steppe had meant following herds through harsh wind. Now, as glaciers retreated, those same valleys grew into green patches. Meltwater carved rivers across plains, depositing fine silt and building rich new floodplains. The barren ground, scoured by glaciers, became open to plants, creating more mixed environments where wild grasses, shrubs, and stands of trees took root. For humans, this meant no more endless pursuit across stark tundra alone. Now there was fresh water close at hand, more varied food sources, and eventually habitats that made permanent camps possible. And yet, just as the thaw seemed to promise stability, disaster pressed in again. Climate is rarely a steady line. After the long freeze loosened, a sudden cold relapse struck, the younger Dryas. In what had seemed the easing of glacial grip, abrupt cold storms returned. Rising and falling temperatures tested populations who had just begun to settle into new patterns. Streams froze again, plants retreated, herds changed their courses. It was not a single season, but a jolt that required another shift in strategy. Those who thought the thaw meant safety found that nothing was guaranteed. This oscillation between warmth and freeze forced invention. You can imagine how vital it became to secure food not just for the present, but for stretches of scarcity. One strategy was storage. People began to gather in ways that anticipated tomorrow instead of only today. Pits and containers preserved dried meat, seeds, and fish. New tools appeared: grinding stones, heavier sickle-like blades for harvesting wild grains, stronger baskets for carrying. With ice unpredictable, putting resources aside was a hedge against relapse. Hunting itself became more specialized. Where giant herds had once dominated open steppe, smaller animals thrived in patchier forests and river valleys that followed the glaciers back. Groups shifted their prey choice. They trapped, angled fish, or stalked deer and wild cattle. Spears and atlatl darts remained, but new designs targeted fleet, medium-sized animals. A world reshaped by thaw meant hunting was no longer only about brute scale, but about precision and variety. Adapting to smaller game encouraged sharper techniques for processing hides, bones, and meat in ways that maximized value from each animal taken. Alongside hunting stood another transition. Plant use became central. Wild cereals found fertile ground in the freshly exposed soils of the Near East. Groups did not yet farm in the sense we know, but patterns were emerging. Seeds were gathered and sowed loosely to ensure they returned in favoured places. Simple irrigation by channeling streams may have begun. Careful tending of plants, accidental at first, became deliberate through repetition. Out of this cycle, farming began. It was born not as sudden invention, but as a practical response to unstable climate. If herds shifted unpredictably, why not develop steadier reliance on plants close to camp? The Levant region offers one of the clearest clues of this change. There, the land emerging from glacial retreat provided fertile valleys that mixed river water with silt. Groups could experiment, testing whether wild cereals could be encouraged to grow in chosen plots. Layer by layer, practices of scattering seed, harvesting and storing became traditions. Hunting remained vital, but cultivation now walked alongside it. The long chase of reindeer gave partial way to stationary plots of wheat and barley. The younger Dryas cold relapse sharpened this practice. When grazing animals grew scarce, people leaned further into crops and storage. Such steps mark the beginning of settled life. Instead of seasonal paths trailing after herds, families began to stay longer in chosen places. Settlements grew from simple camp clusters into semi-permanent hamlets. Mud brick structures appeared in some regions. Granaries followed. Fire pits multiplied, no longer single household marks but community hearths. In short, change in climate drove change in culture. The retreat of ice sheets and the shock of renewed cold did not just test survival, they pressed invention out of necessity. It might sound like a gentle transition, but for those living then it was struggle. Imagine ancestors raised to track animals now asked to tend plants. Imagine children once taught migration paths, now learning how to weave baskets to store grain. Entire systems of knowledge shifted under the weight of fluctuation. The younger Dryas was not only cold, it was a cultural crucible. Out of crisis, humans created new rhythms that shifted life from constant motion to the beginnings of settlement. Seen from the long view, this was the turning point. The ice retreat gave land for crops, rivers for irrigation, and opportunities for larger groups to gather. The relapse forced efficiency and thinking ahead. Together they wove the first strands of agriculture, which then reshaped social life. Larger groups could stay rooted for longer seasons. Trade became steadier across fixed locations. Rituals found anchors not only in caves but in village centres. Over time, this transition unlocked the growth of towns and agriculture as we know them. The mini payoff, then, is straightforward. Crisis forced change. Without abrupt shifts of temperature, people may have continued as mobile hunters for far longer. But with unstable climates, invention became a necessity rather than optional. Planting, storing, organizing, and constructing, all these became the new survival strategies. Out of such pressure came the leap toward farming and permanent life. We see here how climate clocked human progress. Ice melted, but then returned. People bent their skills to meet both, and while the glaciers receded for good, the practices born in their shadow continued until agriculture spread across continents and made settled civilization possible. So as we carry this picture forward, we see how those climate fingerprints still mark us now. The foods we grow, the storage we build, the settlements we live in, all traceable to that turning when the Ice Age unwound and new patterns began. And so our path flows onward from retreating ice and unstable ground to another chamber of meaning, into caves where memory itself was painted across stone. There, art, music, and ritual told stories of the world that was changing around them. A torch flickers against stone, shadows leap, and in the shifting light a painted beast springs forward. On the wall is a horse, its body stretched in motion, legs lifted as if running across the rock itself. Next to it, a row of bison crowd into view, horns lowered, muscles bulging with tension. It feels as if the cave has become a theatre, walls alive with herds forever moving. This is the first image to hold in mind. People deep in darkness, carrying flame, transforming stone into a stage where memory and imagination met. Caves like Lascaux and Chauvet carry these images in detail. They are not scratches or idle marks cut during waiting hours. They are full animals painted with curves, depth and motion, strong enough that even today you can sense their vitality. Someone chose pigments, red ochre drawn from earth, black made from charcoal, yellow from minerals. They mixed these colours, ground powders, spat or blew them through hollow bones, and outlined figures with fingers or brushes. Each action required intention. This was not simple decoration, but labour bound to meaning. The question that lingers is why? Were these walls canvases for beauty alone, or did they stand as part of ritual, hunting magic, or practical record? Some figures appear layered, painted atop older images. That layering may have echoed seasons, marking cycles of herds returning or vanishing. Patterns of dots and marks alongside the animals suggest something closer to a calendar, perhaps tracking when certain species were most abundant. Imagine counting moons not with paper or numbers, but by painting notches beside a reindeer. The wall itself could become ledger, guide, and memory tool, and yet the precise function remains hard to state. If it were simply field notes, why the care for motion? Why the depth of shading? The choice of squeezed perspective? There is ceremony tucked in these forms. To enter a cave's deep chamber with fire far from daylight and paint a scene in echoing darkness was an act apart from hunting itself. Perhaps it bound people together. Perhaps it told stories at gatherings. Perhaps it rehearsed a chase yet to come. We should hold the ambiguity. Art arises not from one need alone, but from many woven together. These caves were not the only sites of meaning. Objects moved with people as well, carrying symbolism wherever they went. Small figurines carved from stone, ivory or bone appear across Ice Age sites. Many represent human figures with exaggerated features, sometimes broad hips and bodies, sometimes abstracted forms. Scholars often call them Venus figures. They draw attention both to fertility and to human presence itself. To shape such figures required planning and hours of work, cutting and polishing with stone blades until a miniature body emerged from material once part of mammoth tusk or limestone chunk. If figurines gave weight to human form, music gave sound to social life. Among the earliest finds are flutes carved from bird bone or hollow mammoth ivory, pierced with holes placed for melody. A person blowing through such an instrument could produce notes across multiple pitches. To imagine Ice Age life without music is to miss a dimension of their culture. Around central fires, songs would rise, rhythms marked hunts, rituals carried sound into darkness. Music is not survival in the narrow sense. It is survival in the social, binding people in synchrony and memory. What unites wall paintings, figurines, and instruments is not their form but their function as memory devices. They preserved ideas in tangible shapes. A painted bison held knowledge of herd rhythm. A figurine carried identity or meaning of fertility. A flute sustained patterns of sound across generations. These objects and images live as archives, built not on paper, but on stone, bone, and breath. Layer by layer, they captured cultural knowledge the way sediment captures history of rivers. One striking element is the choice of location. Not all caves were painted. Only certain chambers bear this weight. Many are deep, narrow, far from direct entry. To reach them, you must enter the earth, squeeze through passages, breathe smoky torch air. That effort itself becomes ceremony, shaping the mental space of the act. The fact that some images sit where few could see them daily implies they were not meant merely for casual viewing. They were for specific moments, perhaps linked to seasons or rituals known only to the group. We can also notice the precision of technique. Painters used the natural contours of the cave to suggest form. A bulge of stone becomes the body of an animal. A crack may become a horn or spine. By fitting art to geology, they merged image with environment. The rock was not passive background, it became collaborator. That blending points to a relationship with the world that saw image and land as entwined. Portable art also shows movement of symbols across regions. Figurines discovered thousands of miles apart share similar features. This suggests ideas travelled with trade routes and migrations. A string of beads made from shells may come from shores far away, showing exchange not only of materials but of meaning. Carved figures, worn smooth by hands, could pass from one camp to another, carrying identity across landscapes. When we look at them today, we see not isolated communities but connected ones, sharing a symbolic vocabulary stitched by trade and contact. Consider again the flutes. To play melody, one must think of time, sequence, and pattern. These qualities extend beyond song. They are cognitive foundations for measuring cycles, for structuring stories, for teaching skills. Music then is not side ritual. It shapes minds capable of planning, coordination, and memory. When young children sat near the fire and heard flutes, they learned not just rhythm but the possibility of structuring experience in ordered ways. Art, figurines, and song-trained capacities beyond immediate survival. So when we ask whether cave paintings were art, ritual, or hunting record, the best answer may be all three at once. They functioned as memory, ceremony, rehearsal, and beauty. Just as a ledger today can be both practical and symbolic, these images bound together multiple purposes. They were neither idle scribbles nor ornaments. They were archives. Through pigments, carvings, and sounds, Ice Age humans recorded knowledge, expressed belief, and fostered community. The mini payoff is this. Caves and objects of the Ice Age were story chambers. They were not random walls of paint, not toys of idle craft, but systems for carrying myth and memory across generations. They served as archives where words alone could not last, repositories where image, shape, and sound locked meaning into matter. Those dots beside painted herds hint at timing. Follow that thought out of the cave, from marks on walls to marks on bone, from torchlit images to calendars you could carry. A strip of reindeer antler rests in your hand. Along one edge runs a line of shallow notches. They are neither random marks made in passing, nor decorative scratches meant for beauty. They march one after another with quiet regularity. A finger moves across them like steps in a staircase, each groove perhaps echoing a day or a moon or some other rhythm in the world outside. The object sits still, small enough to fit in a pouch, yet it whispers of something larger, time observed, tracked, and remembered. So the question asks itself, did Ice Age people keep calendars, and if so, what were they watching? The answer lies somewhere between certainty and suggestion. Bones and stones preserve hard edges. Ideas, in contrast, leave only shadows. But the shadows repeat enough to deserve attention. Across Ice Age camps, archaeologists have uncovered bones and antlers etched with series of lines or dots. One interpretation is that these marks record cycles of the moon, that slow waxing and waning across roughly 30 nights. When you place about 30 cuts in a row, it begins to feel like a tally of days counted as the sky turned and brightened. Yet, the meaning remains open. Were they tallies of kills, notes of travel, or scratches made idly during long evenings? That question is what makes them so compelling. The most striking evidence comes from those artifacts sometimes labelled batons or staffs. Carved from robust antler, often pierced with one or more holes, they appear functional, as if meant to straighten spear shafts pushed through while still hot from fire. And yet many of these carry grooves, marks, or arranged dots along their surface. Function and symbol together. Did the tool work by day as a shaft straightener, and by night as a calendar in hand? Such double duty would not have been strange. In environments where every carried weight mattered, objects often wore 2 or 3 roles: tool, ornament, marker of memory. These antler rods may have worked the same way. When we shift focus from small objects to the wide walls of caves, a similar possibility emerges. Some panels from places such as Chauvet or Lascaux show clusters of animals: bison, horses, reindeer, each appearing to follow patterns tied to seasonality. The reindeer drawn with antlers fresh and new may mark months of migration. Horses shed winter coats in a certain span. If these images align with seasonal events, then the paintings may carry not only artistic force but a sense of timing, reminders of when a herd would pass again, when rivers thick with salmon would run clear. Still, these connections must be treated carefully, for we enter a zone where art, ritual, and survival interweave. A painted panel can be read in many ways, yet the possibility that Ice Age people tracked seasons on rock suggests minds measuring time in more than meals and nights. And yet, step back, and the language of calendars may mislead us if we see it only in modern terms. We often think of boxes on a wall grid, each square stamped with a number. We keep punctual appointments, we count hours, track minutes. That precision was unnecessary in a steppe where herds dictated movement and rivers guided travel. What mattered instead was cycle, not clock time, but order. Not a date, but the knowledge that reindeer pass after the snows soften, that salmon leap when moonlight on water swells strong, that berries redden in a certain warmth of summer. So when we ask if Ice Age people kept calendars, it may help to reframe. Perhaps they remembered rhythms rather than numbers, pulses rather than points. Think of the night sky as part of that rhythm. Star clusters like the Pleiades shine visibly above horizon lines for part of the year, then sink back into the sun's glare. Some researchers have suggested that Ice Age marks could echo these appearances, that certain animal shapes painted on cave ceilings stand near arrangements resembling Taurus or Orion. These ideas are cautious, yet not impossible. A hunter group moving with seasons might well note which stars rise with particular animals. To see the cluster appear was to anticipate events on land. Whether they mapped constellations as we know them is another matter, but the potential recognition of repeating sky patterns adds another layer to Ice Age observation. Now picture the learning process itself. Imagine a child seated by the hearth, a parent tracing a finger across notched bone, counting each mark aloud in cadence. Or perhaps it was sung, the cycle turned into chant or verse, an oral melody easy to repeat, hard to forget. This turns the tally into more than numbers, it becomes a song. In such rhythm, children learned which notch heralded the salmon run, which groove signalled migration toward grazing fields. Calendars, if they existed, may well have lived not only in objects but in memory patterns tied to voice, sound, and group recital. What survives for us are mere scratches, echoes of a larger performance that blended words and marks together. The difference between having a calendar and having nothing is not trivial. In an unpredictable climate, knowing the right moment to set out could be life itself. Migrating too early risked meeting herds not yet arrived. Too late, and the animals had already passed. A recall of cycle-anchored groups in the flow of seasons. Each notch, each mark was a hedge against disorder. Even if the measure was approximate, it steadied action. Survival often comes not from precision, but from arriving near enough to the right time. In that sense, Ice Age timekeeping was practical science bound into culture, written not in books but across tools and walls. There is one subtle clue that marks may indeed reflect cycles rather than chance. Many sets of notches cluster close to the number 29 or 30. That echoes the length of the lunar month, which repeats with gentle regularity. If these marks were random, the distribution might scatter. Instead, they suggest pattern. Even if each cut was made without formal numbers, a group watching the moon waxing and waning could have cut daily notches, ending when the moon narrowed to nothing. This slow record, repeated and passed around, could have taught awareness of the sky in a way we now take for granted with clocks on every wall. Yet the moon was not their only marker. Animal behaviour offered calendars of its own. The reindeer herd was a clock moving over grass. The salmon run was a living countdown in water. The molt of a bison, the shift in bird migration, all offered reliable check marks in the flow of time. What we call calendars may simply be layered awareness of these cues, stored in memory and sometimes rendered in scratches. It was not clocks versus ignorance. It was cycles versus dates. And cycles suited their lives more deeply because they answered the real questions. When do we move? When do we wait? When will the world change underfoot? Some fragments of cave art hint at larger cosmic connections, though we treat them as suggestions, not settled fact. A panel showing a bull, stars over its back, could align with the constellation Taurus. Dot clusters near painted animals may mirror astrophysical groupings, but even without full certainty, the proposal itself teaches us something important, that humans at this early stage of culture were watching not only the ground but the heavens. We should not reduce them to survival machines scratching along the margins of cold. They observed, charted, and speculated, turning the night sky into canvas for wonder as much as the cave walls themselves. One way to imagine their system is to think of it as a braid. One strand, lunar marks etched into bone. Another, seasonal animal behaviour recorded in memory and art. And a third, star groups overhead, rising and falling with months. Woven together, these strands formed a durable sense of timing. No square calendars, no ticking hands of clocks. Instead, a braid of cues guiding decisions on when to migrate, when to plant roots, when to ready spears. The braid built resilience across centuries. At the personal level, timing meant security. To know when to set out gave confidence that food waited ahead. To misjudge could spell hunger. Communities came together around this knowledge. A camp that knew the salmon run's moment could share fish with others. A group that gauged reindeer migration helped allies prepare. Calendars became not only tools for subsistence, but foundations of sharing, forging ties between scattered families. In time, those ties hardened into cultures that stretched across lands, connected by the same cycles. We can also imagine the meaning layered into these practices. The moon's growth and decline might have carried spiritual depth, just as day and night already did. Marks carved in antler could have been more than tally. They could mark a sacred rhythm. Animal symbols on cave walls may have functioned both as reminders of herds and as sacred beings embodying passage of time. Calendars, then, lived not only in material and mind, but also in ritual. To sing the cycle was to take part in cosmic renewal. For us, the calendar is secular. For them, it was inseparable from meaning. And here lies an important note. Calendrical systems emerged not only from curiosity, but from need. Agricultural farmers many millennia later built elaborate formal calendars to know when to sow and reap. For Ice Age hunters, the need was earlier, but the stakes were just as sharp. Predicting when to shift camp, when to prepare traps, when to store, these things meant survival. The fact that we find suggestive marks so widespread testifies that many groups were working towards similar solutions. Without exact numeric language, they nonetheless crafted tool-assisted awareness of temporal flow. Consider how powerful such knowledge would have felt around a fire. Someone points to the moon rising thin on the horizon, then gestures to the notched bone. The group knows from memory what comes next, the deep migration. In that moment, abstract marks guide human movement across hundreds of miles. Time, once intangible, now becomes portable, held in the pocket, carried in a pouch, invoked at will. That is a quiet revolution. And yet, the most striking quality here may be scale. These calendars were small, bone rods, painted walls, spoken songs. They lack the grandeur of later Stonehenges or carved stele. But in their modesty, they reveal another truth. What mattered was not the object, but the rhythm held within. These small notches gave rise to decisions measured in thousands of lives over millennia. In this way, the scale of the record belied the scale of its effect. Tiny objects steered vast migrations, shaping histories we still inherit. If this question is your kind of slow burn, tap like so others can find it. Because to me, it is one of the clearest windows into how Ice Age humans saw themselves in relation to the world around them, not only as hunters on ground, but as observers of cycles above. They stood under the same stars with the same moon, carving small witness into bone. So the answer to our question circles back again. Did they keep calendars? Perhaps not as we would recognize them, not as tables of numbered months. But the evidence suggests a patient observation of cycles, lunar rhythms carved in bone, animal seasons painted on walls, stars possibly marked in dots. And through these cues they built memory and taught the next generation when to act. Their calendars may have been small, but their timing was vast, and beneath those handheld cycles, a deeper metronome kept time, the planet's own swing. So let's imagine the Earth as a slow-spinning top, not flawless, not stable, but leaning, swaying, and circling with a rhythm too long for one lifetime to feel. From our short view, the planet seems fixed. The sun rises, sets, and returns on schedule. Seasons come and go. But over deep time, that regularity bends. The Earth tips by degrees, nods forward then back, shifts its path around the sun in almost imperceptible ways. These motions are subtle, yet together they write the script for when glaciers rise and fall. Now think about sunlight. It does not strike the planet evenly. Depending on tilt, some places get longer summers, shorter winters, while others lean away into harder cold. Over thousands of years, these shifts change the amount of energy different regions receive. A snowy plain may remain frozen or melt depending on a fraction more or less energy. The difference sounds slight, but it cascades into enormous consequences. Ice stays or it vanishes. Grasslands spread or forests creep in. Humanity's stage shifts because the planet moves in tiny ways that add up. We might ask, if glaciers advance once, why do they not continue without end? You could picture them as a momentum, like water freezing on a pond. Once the ice spreads, shouldn't it keep spreading, covering all? But that is not how Earth works. The answer lies in three quiet cycles working together, what scientists sometimes describe with simple words: the stretch, the tilt, and the wobble. Each is a separate motion, but in combination they form Earth's clock. The stretch is Earth's orbit itself, which is not a perfect circle, but draws long and short paths around the Sun. Sometimes the orbit is more oval, sometimes more round. When stretched into an oval, the planet spends longer away from the warmth. When it rounds close again, sunlight distributes more evenly. That slow stretching cycle alone spans tens of thousands of years, long enough that generations pass without noticing, yet strong enough to seed ice ages. The tilt is Earth's axial angle, the leaning of the planet relative to its path. Today it is tilted enough to give us marked seasons, but that tilt adjusts. Sometimes it leans more steeply, sometimes less. Steeper tilt exaggerates seasons, hotter summers, harsher winters. Shallower tilt dampens them, smoothing climate, favouring spreading ice because summers are too weak to melt the snows of winter. That tilt oscillates slowly, a metronome marking not hours but epochs. The wobble, or precession, is the slow circling of Earth's axis itself, like a top tracing a small circle while it spins. This alters when seasons occur in the orbit. Northern summers may line up with the point closest to the Sun, or with the point farthest away. Over millennia, this when matters as much as the how much. If northern summers arrive at the far point, they weaken. Ice lingers, glaciers gain ground. If they align with the closer point, warmth erodes snow. Individually, these cycles seem weak. Together they amplify. Like smaller pendulums pushing a larger one, they can set grand swings in motion. Here lies the climate rhythm known as the Milankovitch cycles. You may picture them as three gears turning at different speeds, sometimes aligning, sometimes diverging. When the gears click into place, energy received and reflected at Earth's surface changes enough to tip balance between growth and retreat of ice. A pendulum makes a useful image. With each orbit stretch, each tilt change, each axis wobble, the pendulum of Earth's climate swings one way or the other. It does not swing quickly. These beats span thousands of years. But in the quiet sum of their cycles, whole ice ages pulse in and out. The glaciers advance, pause, pull back, then advance again, like the slow inhaling and exhaling of the planet itself. To those who lived at the time, the movement was not visible over a life, but over many generations, valleys choked with ice, coasts withdrew, rivers altered. Entire homelands changed because the pendulum shifted. This perspective means that ice ages are not flukes. They are not random storms of geology waiting without cause. They are the predictable, if complex, results of orbital mechanics. Earth's deep time music plays on cycles written by cosmic pulls. The sun draws steady, but the planet's dance around it signals climate. Like a great clock ticking out beats longer than history, these subtle nudges keep time with glaciers and melt. At the height of these shifts lay the last glacial maximum, the period when ice reached its greatest spread. This was the full power of those cycles aligned, orbit stretched, tilt modest, wobble reinforcing, all producing less summer melt in the north. Ice piled high, Seas sank, continents wore an icy frame. That moment's severity was not simply random coincidence, it was the swing cresting, the pendulum lifted to its outermost position by combined cycles. Imagine standing there as a witness, the planet's axis invisible, the orbit unseen, and yet beneath your feet, mile-thick ice bore the weight of cosmic rhythms. The glaciers did not grow by accident any more than tides happen without the moon. They grew because Earth leaned, stretched, and wobbled in time with forces larger than any hunter or herd. Humanity existed inside a pattern it could not sense directly, except by the landscape it inhabited. Ice at the edge of sight was the visible edge of invisible mechanics. And still, because these cycles continue, the ice did not stay at its furthest reach. Seasons began to shift again, tilt altered back, wobble drifted away. Over thousands of years, warmth took hold and glaciers withdrew. Valleys reopened, rains returned. This retreat felt like reprieve for those who lived through it, but it was simply the pendulum continuing in the other direction. The rhythm did not end. It kept its pace, indifferent, repeating, writing eras instead of hours. So the mini payoff is clear. Ice ages are not random storms frozen in planetary history. They are the predictable beats of Earth's orbit and spin. What seems like chaos across centuries is, over longer spans, pattern. Glaciers rise, fall, and return in tune with cycles carved by deep time. Understanding that rhythm does not change our position within it, but it shifts how we view our story. We are participants inside planetary music, not separate from it. From this rhythm of tilt, stretch, and wobble, we step outward again. Because what interests us now is not only why the planet shifted into ice, but how those shifts left their fingerprints in us. From the mechanism itself, our path now follows the echoes that remain, pressed into our genes, our tools, our cultures, and even the ground beneath our modern shores. The Ice Age did not end when glaciers retreated. Its marks remain etched in us. Our genes still carry adaptations shaped by cold, by hunger, by contact with other humans who no longer walk. You can feel its touch in how our immune systems respond, or in traits that shape how we live at altitude or resist certain stresses. The tools we hold, the way we organize food and memory, all echo survival strategies born in glacial nights. The Ice Age was not an ending. It was the soil under our beginning. Stay with the question, subscribe for more long-form journeys through deep time,